The US-European defense relationship is under pressure. Europe is rearming. The United States has signaled a shift in its focus to the Indo-Pacific, and questions about the European defense architecture are being widely debated. This video is not about suggesting how a new European defense structure could look like. Rather, it is about understanding how the existing system came to function in practice, and about highlighting some of the key characteristics that shaped it during the Cold War. In order to understand current debates, it is useful to approach them historically and investigate the case in which mutual defense was not only an ideological principle, but a practical arrangement built through mutual commitments, rising geostrategic relevance, and political trust. The case of Norway during the Cold War offers valuable insight. This is a story of how a small NATO state navigated through growing vulnerability and uncertainty in a landscape of increasing strategic importance. As a member of the Western Bloc and of NATO, with an extensive Atlantic coastline, Norway faced the challenge of managing its relationship with its Soviet neighbor while remaining firmly aligned with the Western alliance. This became especially important as Soviet military and geopolitical power in the north grew, notably through the Soviet Northern Maritime Fleet and the Kola military complex. Throughout this period, Norway pursued a strategy of balancing Western defense integration with self-imposed restraints to keep tensions low in its immediate vicinity. From the late 1950s and especially during the 1960s, the expansion of the Soviet Northern Fleet gave Norway's maritime area greater strategic importance. The fleet would soon include strategic nuclear submarines, connecting the Norwegian North to questions of nuclear deterrence and control of the North Atlantic. Soviet exercises also moved further into the Norwegian Sea and the North Atlantic, challenging NATO's naval position and increasing the importance of the waters north of the Guyuk Gap, the area between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. This created a difficult situation for Norway. Norway needed NATO, and especially the United States, for protection. But too much Allied activity close to the Soviet border could provoke Moscow and heighten tensions in the north. Norway therefore had to present itself as a valuable asset to the alliance, while still ensuring that Allied activity would not lead to unnecessary escalation and instability in the region. The Norwegian government's main objective was to strengthen cooperation with allied countries in the north and to make agreements that firmly integrated the area into NATO's protection zone. Norwegian authorities were aware of the strategically disadvantaged position it would face in strictly bilateral talks with the Soviet Union, and therefore sought to reach agreements through multilateral frameworks and careful diplomacy. This strategy remained a constant in Norwegian foreign policy throughout the Cold War. Meanwhile, the broader nuclear deterrence landscape was evolving. As Soviet nuclear capabilities became more prominent throughout the 1960s, the US strategic nuclear posture also changed. The US would eventually move away from the strategy of massive retaliation, where the main threat was that any major attack on Western Europe or its broader interests could be met with the overwhelming use of nuclear weapons, towards a more limited strategy called the flexible response. The logic was that the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons became less potent once the Soviet Union had credible second strike capabilities, aligning with the principle of mutual assured destruction. Some Western European countries, including Norway, saw this strategic shift with concern, fearing they would be left vulnerable in case of Soviet aggression. But another effect was that it heightened the demand for surveillance, intelligence sharing, and early warning systems in the north. This demand became a crucial advantage for Norway, given its strategic position. This also brings us to another very important aspect of the broader collective defense architecture, namely the principle of mutuality. Norway was able to provide reconnaissance, geographic expertise, and access to a strategically important area. In return, it received increased military protection and reassurance, as well as stronger Allied commitment to the northern region. The presence and interest of both Allied and Norwegian forces increased significantly in this area from the 1960s onward, driven by shared military interests. Nevertheless, the relationship also had its limits. Norway's policy of no permanent foreign military bases and no nuclear weapons on Norwegian territory in peacetime reflected a perception that an excessive Allied presence near the Soviet Union could increase tensions. Norwegian authorities tried to manage its alliance relationship in a way that strengthened deterrence without increasing the risk of escalation. A good example of this was the US Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson's state visit to Norway in 1963. The American delegation wanted to visit Kirkenes, a city very close to the Soviet border and their military facilities. The request was ultimately rejected because Norwegian authorities feared Soviet reaction to a high-ranking US official visiting such a politically delicate area. On the other hand, the installation of navigation and surveillance systems in Norway proceeded because these systems were important to Norway's alliance obligations and the broader defense structure. This clearly shows elements of the balancing strategy. Norway limited some form of Allied presence, but accepted others when deemed necessary. There were also other important developments during the same period. During the 1970s, the emergence of new international maritime laws and Norway's major expansion of its economic zone had a significant impact on Norway's position. Together with the management of important resources in these waters, this affected how questions of sovereignty were handled during the Cold War. Norway established a 200 nautical mile economic zone, which greatly expanded the scope of Norwegian economic interests. This also increased the region's importance and had new implications for its relations with other states, including allies. After the creation of the economic zone, it became clearer and more important for Norway to assert sovereignty and to demonstrate to the outside world its ability to control and govern its own areas. Huge investments and commitments thus followed to fulfill these obligations, but even here some exceptions remained. The archipelago of Svalbard, situated in the high north, constituted a distinct case. Military training and exercises and the presence of military vessels and equipment were allowed only after specific consultations with and approval from the Norwegian state. This was connected to the sensitive position of Svalbard, Soviet-Russian historical presence on the archipelago, and the Svalbard Treaty. Norwegian policy in this case was again to combine a strict upholding of its sovereignty with non-provocative measures. Furthermore, two submarine incidents in particular tested the mechanisms for maintaining stability in the Norwegian maritime areas. In Sognefjorden in 1972, reports of a possible submarine deep inside Norwegian territorial waters led Norway, with NATO and especially British support, to launch extensive yet cautious search operations. Although the presence of a submarine could not be proven beyond doubt during or after the investigations, the episode served as a catalyst for new formalized rules of engagement in Norwegian maritime areas. After this incident, unidentified submarines operating deep inside close waters would no longer necessarily receive prior warnings. They could instead be targeted and attacked immediately after entering illegal areas. These stricter rules of engagements were put to test in another submarine incident in 1983, where the Norwegian response was considerably more assertive. These incidents show that the pursuit of stability was not simply about avoiding confrontation at all costs. It was also about rules, procedures, and establishing firm red lines. Norway had to demonstrate its readiness to defend its territory and maritime areas, both to assert sovereignty over the region and to fulfill its broader burden-sharing obligations within the alliance. So, what does the Norwegian case suggest about the mutual defense structure? Firstly, NATO was created as a mutual defense agreement with the ultimate aim of preserving peace and security in Europe. During the Cold War, that system became practical through concrete arrangements with an emphasis on mutuality among its members. Norway demonstrated this at the edge of the alliance's borders, far from the central battlefield of Cold War Europe, where the two Germanys, and especially Berlin, served as the main frontier. Norway needed protection, but they could also offer something very valuable in return. These considerations remain relevant today, even if the strategic context may have changed. Norway and Northern Europe more generally still occupy an important position within NATO's broader defense structure. Sweden and Finland's entry into NATO only increases this significance. At the same time, Norway sought to avoid unnecessary escalation by limiting Allied presence in sensitive areas and carefully managing its relationship with the Soviet Union. The threat did not disappear, but this approach helped keep tensions in the north relatively stable and reduce the risk of dangerous escalation. This is why the Norwegian case remains relevant today. It shows that alliances are not sustained solely by ideology or treaty obligations. They're also sustained by mutual interest, practical contributions, and the ability to manage risk. Today, the question is whether that mutuality still functions in the same way, whether it is equally as valuable as it once was, and whether it is enough to face the geopolitical realities of the present. Many of the central issues of the Cold War are no longer the same, but the issue of European security has not disappeared, quite the contrary. If Europe is to take greater responsibility for its own defense, what role will the United States play in the future European security architecture, and what implications will this have for the current nuclear deterrence structure in Europe? History alone cannot answer these questions, but it can help us understand the mechanisms of the system we inherited and perhaps guide us in thinking more clearly about the choices facing European security today.